The women of Grover's Bluff had a saying about the ranch on the high ridge. They said the mountain let you in easy enough. It was the man inside that sent you back down. Nobody counted the exact number of women who had come and gone from that property over the years. But Gerald Finch, who ran the post office out of a narrow building wedged between the feed store and the barber shop on Main Street, claimed he had forwarded at least 9 return letters on behalf of 9 different women. All of them addressed back east. All of them written within the first week of arrival. He mentioned this the way a man mentions weather. Matter of fact. Inevitable. Not cruel. Just honest in the way that small towns tend to be honest, which is to say completely and without mercy. Winifred Vale did not know about Gerald Finch or his letters when she made her decision. She knew only what she had decided, standing alone in a rented room in Philadelphia on a gray October morning in 1882, holding a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft as old cloth. The paper bore an official seal. It bore the signatures of 3 men she had once respected. And it bore a judgment written in careful, measured language that said, in essence, that she was not enough. Not enough to be a wife. Not enough to be a mother. Not enough to remain among people who had once called her neighbor and colleague and friend. She read it one last time. Then she held it over the candle on the nightstand and watched it burn. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the weeks before, alone and quietly, the way she did most difficult things. By the time the paper was ash, she was finished with that particular grief. She brushed the remnants into the small tin waste bin, put on her coat, and walked to the stage office to purchase a ticket west. She had a name on a piece of correspondence she had received 6 weeks prior. A man named Cormac Halstead, 400 acres above the tree line outside a town called Grover's Bluff, Colorado. The letter had been brief to the point of being almost rude. No flattery, no promises, no careful language designed to make the arrangement sound like something it was not. Just the facts of the land, the work required, the terms of the arrangement, and a signature at the bottom in tight, even handwriting that she had studied longer than she intended to. She had received other letters. Men who wrote of love before they had ever seen her face. Men who described their properties in the language of salesmen. Men who made her feel, before she had even replied, that she was already being managed. Cormac Halstead's letter had not done any of those things. It had simply told her the truth about what he needed and left the decision entirely to her. She chose him for that reason, though she would not have said so aloud. The journey west took 11 days. She spent most of it watching the land change outside the window, the flat certainty of the eastern states giving way to something wider and less decided, the sky growing larger as though it had been waiting for room to become what it actually was. She thought about her former employer, a man named Harcourt, who had accused her of stealing from the company ledgers after she had quietly discovered that he was the one doing the stealing. She thought about the trial that had never happened, the settlement that had been reached in his favor, the position she had lost, the reputation that had followed. She thought about her former husband, Edmund, who had chosen to believe Harcourt because it was easier than believing her, and who had used the scandal as the clean excuse he had been looking for to end a marriage he had grown tired of long before that. She thought about the letter from the church council, about the word they had used, incomplete. She had turned that word over for months, the way you turn a stone over, looking for what lives underneath. She had examined it from every angle. She had tried to find the angle from which it was not true. She was still trying when she stepped off the stage in Grover's Bluff on a cold Tuesday morning in October and felt the mountain air hit her face like a door opening onto a room she had not expected. It was sharp and clean and entirely indifferent to everything she had left behind. She breathed it in. Gerald Finch was at the stage stop, ostensibly sorting a packet of mail, actually watching her with the undisguised curiosity of a man who has been waiting to see the 10th woman and is not certain what to make of her. He was a small man with a large mustache and the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of other people's business. He introduced himself. He told her, with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who believes in preparing people for the truth, that Cormac Halstead was not an easy man to know. 9 women, he said in a tone that was not unkind. 9 letters back east, all within the first week. Winifred looked at him steadily. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Gerald studied her for a moment the way a man studies a fence line he is not sure will hold. Then he nodded once and went back to his mail. She had the distinct impression that he was reassessing his estimate, which had apparently been 4 days. Cormac Halstead was waiting at the edge of the road near the stage stop. She had tried during the journey not to form a picture of him from the letter alone. She had largely failed. The man standing at the edge of the road was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said exactly what she had imagined. He was tall and built through the shoulders in the way of men who have spent years doing physical work without thinking of it as anything other than what needs doing. His jaw was angular, his expression unreadable, and he wore his hat with the particular efficiency of a man who has never once thought about how he wears his hat. He held it in one hand and looked at her the way a man looks at a new piece of equipment, assessing, neutral, not unwelcoming, but not anything else either. "Miss Vale," he said. "Mr. Halstead," she said. He picked up her trunk without asking and carried it to the wagon. He did not offer his hand to help her up. She did not wait for it. She gathered her skirts and climbed up herself, settled her bag in her lap, and looked out at the road ahead while he came around to the other side and took up the reins. They rode for 2.5 hours without exchanging more than a dozen words. The trail climbed steadily, the pine trees thickening on either side until the town below disappeared entirely, and there was nothing around them but the mountain and the enormous pale sky above it. Winifred watched the landscape and said nothing. She had learned, some years ago, that silence was not the same as emptiness, and that a person who rushed to fill it usually did so for their own comfort rather than anyone else's. She used the time to observe. His hands on the reins were careful without being tense. He had a scar along his right wrist, pale and old, from something she did not ask about. When a branch came down across the trail from an overnight wind, he got down, moved it without comment, and got back up without looking at her to see if she was impressed. He was not performing competence. He simply had it, the way some people have it, as a condition of their existence rather than a thing they have worked to demonstrate. She noticed the way he guided the horses around the worst of the ruts in the road. She noticed that he did it quietly, almost apologetically, as though he was sorry the road was rough. She noticed that he did not notice her noticing. They passed a small marker at the side of the trail where the road curved before beginning its final climb. It was not a grave marker, exactly. More a cairn, 3 flat stones stacked with evident care, with a piece of cloth tied to a branch above it. The cloth had been there long enough to fade, but not long enough to shred. Someone tended it. Cormac did not look at it as they passed, but his hands tightened on the reins for exactly 1 second. Winifred said nothing. She looked away from the cairn and back at the road. But she filed that second away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered before she knew why. The ranch appeared around a long bend in the trail, and Winifred's first impression was of solidity. The house was well built, built with knowledge and intention rather than just necessity. 2 stories of timber and stone that had settled into the mountain the way things settle when they have been there long enough to belong. But it had been stripped of anything that softened it. No curtains in the windows visible from the outside. No flower box. No wreath on the door, though the season would have called for one. It was a working house, and every surface said so. The way a person's face sometimes says something they have long stopped saying with words. There was a barn twice the size of the main structure, a smokehouse, a water pump that looked recently repaired, a wood pile stacked with a precision most men reserved for financial documents. The yard was clean. The fences were sound. Everything was maintained to a standard that spoke of genuine care, and nothing was maintained to a standard that spoke of joy. She stood in the yard for a moment and took it in. "I'll show you the inside," Cormac said from somewhere behind her. The inside matched the outside, functional, clean in a deliberate, almost austere way. A table with 2 chairs, an iron stove that had been recently blacked, shelves of supplies organized by category and then by size. A single piece on the wall that she first took for a painting and then recognized, on closer inspection, as a hand-drawn map of the property lines, rendered in careful detail with elevations noted in the margins. No photographs, no letters left on the mantel, no small accumulated objects, the coins and buttons and ticket stubs and pieces of ribbon that gather in a lived-in home the way sediment gathers at the bottom of a river. The house was clean of all of it. It looked less like a place someone lived in and more like a place someone was waiting in. She took that in without comment. "Your room is there," Cormac said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "Meals at 5:30 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. I work from first light. I don't expect conversation during work hours. Sunday is rest, but the animals still need tending." He paused. "There's a list of household duties on the table." He said all of this the way another man might read from a land registry. No apology, no warmth, no hostility either, which she appreciated more than she would have expected to. She walked to the table and picked up the list. It was thorough, written in the same tight, even hand as the letter that had brought her here. She read it fully and set it back down. "Any questions?" he asked. "Just one," she said, and looked up at him. "Do you eat what you cook yourself, or have you been managing on stubbornness and cold air up here?" Something shifted in his face. It was not a smile, but it was not nothing either. A small, almost involuntary adjustment around the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression a man makes when something catches him off guard, and he decides, in the same moment, not to acknowledge it. "I manage," he said, and walked back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left and looked around at the bare walls, the 2 chairs, the window that faced the mountain without any softening frame. Then she opened her traveling bag and began to unpack. Her room had a lock, a new one recently installed, with a small brass key sitting on the windowsill. She picked up the key and turned it over in her fingers. The lock had not been put there for show. The mechanism was smooth, properly set, fitted by someone who understood what he was doing. He had put it there before she arrived. He had thought about it in advance, this particular courtesy, this particular form of respect offered without ceremony or expectation of thanks. She set the key on the nightstand and did not use the lock that evening. She did not need to. The first dinner was quiet. She cooked from the stores in the pantry. Salt pork, dried beans, cornbread from a recipe she had known since childhood. It was simple food, plain food, the kind of food that makes no claims. Cormac came in at 6 exactly, washed his hands at the basin, sat down, and ate without comment. He ate everything. He pushed the bowl back with a small, almost imperceptible exhale, the particular exhale of a man who has been feeding himself adequately for a long time and has just, without expecting to, been fed well. She noticed that. She also noticed, when she glanced toward the window while clearing the table, that his reflection showed him watching her for just a moment before looking back down at the empty bowl. She said nothing about either thing. He stood to leave, then stopped near the door, his back still to her. "You didn't ask about the others," he said. Winifred set a bowl on the drying cloth and picked up the next one. "No," she said. "I didn't." A long pause. The fire in the stove shifted and settled. "Most women ask within the first 2 hours," he said. "I'm not most women," she said, not sharply, not as a challenge, simply as a fact, the way she might have said that the coffee was ready. He was quiet for another moment. Then he went outside, and she heard his boots cross the porch, and then the barn door, and then nothing but the wind coming down off the mountain and moving through the gap under the kitchen window. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She walked to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight for a while, not anxious, not discouraged, just thinking in the way she did at the end of significant days. There was something underneath all that silence. She had seen it in the precision of his supply shelf, in the hand-drawn map on the wall, in the way he had eaten every bite of plain food without a word of complaint or thanks, as though gratitude was a language he had once spoken fluently, and then at some point had decided was too costly to keep using, as though even small expressions of feeling had become a currency he could not afford to spend. She had known men who were cold because they were selfish. She had known men who were cold because they were afraid. She was beginning to think that Cormac Halstead was cold the way a burned building is cold, not because it was never warm, but because something had gone through it. She blew out the lamp. Outside, the mountain was enormous and dark and entirely indifferent, the way mountains are. And somewhere in the barn below the tree line, she could hear the faint, steady sound of a man who did not know how to stop working, even when the day was long over. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. She was not going anywhere. There were things she had left behind in Philadelphia, a life, a reputation, a marriage, a self she had spent years building only to see it taken apart by someone else's dishonesty and her own refusal to pretend otherwise. She had burned the last document of that old life before she boarded the stage. She had no intention of asking for it back. What she had instead was 400 acres of mountain land, a house with bare walls, a man who spoke in the language of silences, and a brass key sitting on a nightstand in a room with a lock she had not needed to use. She found to her own mild surprise that she was not afraid. She was, if anything, curious. And Winifred Vale had learned, over the course of a life that had not gone gently, that curiosity was a more durable thing than hope. Hope asked for something. Curiosity simply paid attention. and she had always been very, very good at paying attention. The mountain pressed against the window. The barn below was quiet now. Whatever work had kept Cormac Halstead out past dark had finally ended, or been set aside, or simply continued in the stillness that was his natural element. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the ranch, which was not actually silence at all, but a layered and living quiet. The wind in the pines, the distant sound of cattle, the house settling around her like something getting used to bearing weight again. She thought, he is not cold. He is waiting for something he has stopped believing will come. She thought, that is a different problem entirely. Then she slept. The second morning, Winifred woke before the 5:30 bell. She did not know what woke her. The cold coming through the window seam, perhaps, or some internal calibration that had quietly reset itself to this new altitude overnight. She lay still for a moment and listened to the ranch making its early sounds, boots on frozen ground, somewhere below and to the left, the low, unhurried complaint of cattle, the rhythmic pull of the water pump, steady as a clock. He had been up for a while. She dressed without hurrying, moved to the kitchen, and found the stove already laid with fresh wood over coals that had been banked the night before with obvious care. She stood and looked at the coals for a moment. He had not simply left the fire going. He had arranged it so that the morning start would be easy, so that whoever came to the stove first would not have to work from nothing. It was a practical thing. It was also, she recognized, a form of consideration that did not announce itself as consideration. The kind of thing a person does when they have thought about someone else's morning without wanting to be caught thinking about it. She built the fire up and began breakfast before the light had fully reached the kitchen window. He came in at 5:30 exactly, the cold coming in with him, ice crystals on the shoulders of his coat. He washed his hands at the basin with the thoroughness of a man who has done physical work and takes the cleaning of it seriously. Then he sat down. She set a plate in front of him. Cornbread, fried eggs, black coffee. He looked at the plate for half a second longer than he had looked at the stew the night before. Then he picked up his fork and ate without comment. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him, not beside him, not at the far end of the table where distance would have been obvious, directly across where she could see his face in the gray morning light without making a study of it. His jaw tightened very slightly, the small adjustment of a man who had been caught off guard by something ordinary and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He chose not to. "You were up early," he said midway through the meal. His eyes stayed on his plate. "So were you," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave the table as quickly as he had the previous evening either. He finished his coffee and sat for a moment with his hands around the empty cup, looking at some middle distance that had nothing in it. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that with a man like this, silence was not an absence waiting to be corrected. It was a thing he used the way other people used words, to think, to measure, to decide whether the ground was solid enough to take the next step. Rushing, it would only send him back to the barn. He stood eventually, set the cup down, and went outside without another word. But he had stayed 7 minutes longer than the morning before. She noticed that too. She spent the morning learning the house in the way she had learned things her whole life, not by being told, but by looking. She ran her fingers along the window frames to find where the drafts came in. She tested the floorboards near the door to find the soft one that would need attention before winter deepened. She examined the stove from every angle to understand how it drew when the wind came from different directions. The house had been built well and maintained consistently, but it had the particular quality of a place that had been kept functional without being kept alive. Everything worked. Nothing was tended. Near the base of the main room window, she found a crack that had been stuffed with a strip of cloth, rather than properly sealed. A temporary fix made permanent through years of not getting around to it. She found a tin of plaster putty in the supply room, mixed it at the basin, and sealed the crack properly, pressing it smooth with her thumb and letting it set in the morning cold. She was wiping her hands when she heard him come back in from the upper pasture. He stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the window, then at her, then at the window again. "That's been like that for 2 winters," he said. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He stood there for a moment longer, the particular stillness of a man who is trying to decide whether something requires a response. Then he turned and went back outside without another word. She put the putty tin away and returned to the kitchen. That afternoon, without being asked and without mentioning it, she heard him in the supply room for a short while. When she passed the doorway later, the shelf nearest the door, which had developed a lean significant enough that jars slid to one side when placed on it, had been straightened and reset. New wood support, properly fastened. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. And somehow that mutual silence on the subject felt more like a conversation than most conversations she had recently had. By the 3rd day, a shape had begun to form between them. Not warmth. It was far too early and far too guarded for warmth. Something more architectural. A set of unspoken agreements, invisible but load-bearing, the way the beams in the ceiling were invisible but held everything up. She cooked. He worked. She kept the house. He kept the land. At meals they occupied the table together, and the silence between them had shifted from the dense, pressurized silence of 2 strangers forced into proximity to something else, something with a little more air in it. A room they were both standing in, neither quite sure how to furnish it, but no longer actively trying to leave. On the morning of the 4th day, she found the small notebook. She was not looking for it. She was reorganizing the kitchen drawer that held miscellaneous hardware, nails and wire, and a broken clasp she intended to repair when her fingers found it wedged at the very back beneath a folded cloth. It was small, no larger than her palm, with a worn brown cover. She did not open it immediately. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the specific weight of a thing that has been handled many times, and then put away. Then she opened it. The handwriting was not his. It was a woman's writing, looser and more fluid than the tight, controlled hand she had seen on the household list and the property map. The first pages were recipes, salt pork preparations and bread variations, and a particular method for preserving berries that used less sugar than the standard way. There were notes in the margins about adjustments made at altitude, where things rose differently and cooked at different temperatures, the practical knowledge of someone who had learned this kitchen through use. Further in, the recipes gave way to notes of a different kind. Remedies: dried yarrow for fever, willow bark tea for pain. The particular ratio of comfrey to lard for a drawing poultice. The handwriting in these sections was smaller, more careful, as though the writer understood she was recording something important. And at the very back, on the last page, a name had been written. A child's name, she could tell by the diminutive form of it. A name given with tenderness. And then beneath it, in different ink, written perhaps at a different time, a single line through the name, not an erasure. The letters were still visible, just a line through them, the way you cross out something you cannot bring yourself to remove entirely. Winifred sat with the notebook in her hands for a long time. Then she closed it carefully and placed it back exactly where she had found it, beneath the folded cloth, at the back of the drawer. She did not mention it. Not that day, not after. But she thought about what it meant that the notebook was still there, still kept, still placed with that particular kind of care that is not the same as forgetting. She made cornbread with dinner that evening. When she set it on the table, Cormac looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not entirely name. Something passed through his face, quickly, the way weather passes through a landscape. Then he picked up his fork and ate everything. It was on the 7th day that Aldous Vane came. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, a confident pace on the trail below, the sound of a man who was accustomed to arriving places and finding them as he expected. She was outside with a basket of washing when he came around the upper bend, a well-dressed man in his mid-40s on a dark horse that cost more than most men in the county made in a year. He had a face that would have been described as handsome in certain company, the kind of face that has learned to be pleasant in the precise way that is useful and no more. He looked at her with something she recognized immediately, the calculation behind the courtesy, the quick assessment of what she was and what she represented, dressed as consideration. "Miss Vale," he said, which told her that he had known she was here before he arrived. He introduced himself as Aldous Vane. He said the name the way men say names they expect to be recognized. He asked after Cormac in the tone of a man asking after his own property. Cormac came out of the barn while Vane was still talking. He crossed the yard without hurrying, but there was a quality to his movement that Winifred had not seen before. A stillness that had gone rigid, the way water goes rigid when it freezes. Everything on the surface composed and everything underneath changed. "Aldous," Cormac said. "Cormac." Vane smiled with his mouth. "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop and discuss the outstanding matter from last spring. The drought assessment on the Calloway Creek water rights. We never did reach a final number." "We reached a number," Cormac said. "You didn't agree with it." Vane's smile did not change. He looked at Winifred again. "Well, congratulations on your new arrangement. I hope Miss Vale finds the mountain agreeable." He paused. "Better than some others have, at any rate." He said it pleasantly. That was the part she noted most carefully. The words could have been simple well-wishing from a man with no particular intent, but they were not. They were a small, precise insertion, a reminder delivered in the most socially defensible way possible, designed to diminish without appearing to. "Thank you for stopping by," Winifred said, in a tone that matched his pleasantness exactly and committed to nothing. Vane held her gaze for a moment, and she had the impression that he was recalibrating something. Then he touched his hat, exchanged a few more words with Cormac that contained no information and several implications, and rode back down the trail. The yard was quiet after he left. Cormac stood at the edge of the fence line and watched the trail long after the horse had gone from sight. His hands were loose at his sides. She had learned to read his hands. They were not loose because he was relaxed. That evening, after supper, she set the dishes to soak and said without preamble or softness, "The debt he mentioned, is it real?" Cormac was at the table with his coffee. He did not answer immediately. He turned the cup in his hands once, then set it down. "Yes," he said. "How much?" He told her. She kept her face still. It was a significant sum, the kind that could not be managed by an ordinary winter's income, the kind that created leverage for a man willing to use it. "All right," she said simply, and went back to the dishes. She heard him shift in his chair. The following morning, before the light was fully up, she retrieved the ranch ledger from the shelf in the supply room and brought it to the kitchen table. She did not ask permission. The ledger was a household document, and she was part of the household. She opened it to the first page and began to read. She read for 3 hours, working through the columns with the focused attention she had brought to Harcourt's company books years before. Numbers told stories if you were willing to sit with them long enough. They told you what a person valued and what they feared, and what they had been trying to avoid looking at directly. The story in Cormac Halstead's ledger was one of a man who worked exceptionally hard and had been dealt, in addition to everything else, a sequence of genuinely bad luck. The drought of 1881 had been real and had been severe. The losses were real. And the loan from Vane, taken on in desperation, had terms that she read very carefully and then read again. She put the ledger back on its shelf and carried what she had read in the back of her mind the way she carried all important things, quietly and without losing track of it. That same afternoon, near dusk, she went to the side of the barn for the last of the stored firewood and heard something that did not belong to the usual sounds of the ranch at that hour. She set the first armload down and walked around the corner of the barn. Cormac was crouched beside a young calf that had separated from the others and pressed itself against the barn wall, legs tucked, eyes showing white at the edges. Something had frightened it badly. He had one hand pressed flat against its side and was speaking to it in a continuous low murmur, the same voice in terms of volume and cadence as the voice he used for everything, but entirely different in quality. Patient in a way that had no economy to it, gentle in a way that was not performed. The voice of a man who has, in this specific context, stopped measuring what things cost. He did not hear her approach. She stood at the corner of the barn and watched for a moment. This man who organized his household with the precision of a military campaign, who communicated with the minimum number of words that would technically constitute communication, who held himself with the permanent braced quality of someone perpetually prepared for impact, crouched in the last of the evening light with his hand on a frightened animal, his voice doing what his face could not do in company. Something tightened in her chest. Not pity. She was careful to identify it correctly. Not pity, and not the simple warmth of a good impression. Something quieter and more specific than either. Recognition. The particular feeling of seeing something true about a person that they have not shown you intentionally. She stepped back. She picked up her firewood and went inside. At dinner, she kept her face composed and her voice level. "Did the calf settle?" she asked after a moment. Cormac's fork stopped. "You saw that," he said. It was not a question. "I came around the barn for the last of the wood," she said. A pause. He looked at his plate. His jaw moved slightly in the way it did when he was measuring something. "She'll be fine by morning," he said. Winifred nodded and looked back at her own plate, and neither of them said anything more about it. But she had wanted him to know that she had seen it, not to press him with it, not to make anything of it that would cause him to retreat, just to know that she had seen the gentleness under there, as quiet and persistent as groundwater, and that it had not surprised her. The storm arrived on the 9th morning. Not gently. Mountain storms do not arrive gently when they have made up their minds. It came down off the peaks before breakfast, a hard gray sky that rolled in low and fast and settled over the ranch like a held breath before releasing all at once. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped sharply enough that she could see her breath in the kitchen, and the snow came sideways in the particular aggressive way of high country weather that intends to be taken seriously. Cormac came in earlier than usual, snow on his coat, his face raw and red from the wind. He hung the coat by the door and stood at the stove with his hands out toward the heat, and she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked and without making anything of it. Their fingers did not touch, but it was close, and there was something in his expression when he took the cup, just for a fraction of a second before the familiar composure reassembled itself, something unguarded and unprepared, the expression of a man who has been handed something small and ordinary, and has been caught off guard by how much it matters. "Storm will hold through tomorrow," he said, looking at the window. "Then we stay in," she said. He looked at her as though he was not quite sure what to do with the simplicity of that. With the absence of complaint or anxiety, or the particular kind of restlessness that the previous women had apparently displayed when the mountain and the weather and the distance from everything familiar became suddenly and undeniably real. She treated the storm the way she seemed to treat most things, as a fact to be managed rather than a circumstance to be suffered. They spent the day inside. He sat at the table with his account books and correspondence, working through papers with the concentration of a man who views any hour not occupied with useful activity as a personal failing. She went through the storage trunk near the window that she had noticed on her first day and not yet examined. Inside she found, beneath a folded blanket and 2 old coats, a set of curtains, heavy cotton in a deep blue that had faded to something softer and more interesting. They had been washed and folded with evident care, the folds deliberate, the fabric smoothed flat. Someone had put them away carefully. Someone had thought they would be needed again. She examined the windows. The fabric was still good. The rings were intact. She found a step stool in the supply room and spent the better part of 2 hours measuring, trimming where needed, and hanging them in the main room while the storm pressed at the glass outside. At one point she looked over and found Cormac watching her from behind his account books, not reading, watching. When her eyes met his, he looked back down at the page. She turned back to the curtains without comment. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at what she had done to the room. It was not a dramatic change. The curtains did not transform the space, but the lamplight caught in the fabric, and the room had, for the first time, the quality of a place where someone intended to remain, where someone had decided that the view through the window was worth framing. It was a small thing, and it changed something that was not small. Cormac came to stand in the doorway of the main room before supper. He looked at the curtains for a long time. He did not say anything, but he did not look away quickly either, the way a man looks away from things that make him feel something he is not prepared to examine. He stood and looked at the room with its changed light for long enough that she noticed, and then he turned and went to wash up for the meal. After supper, with the storm still working against the windows and the lamp burning between them on the table, he spoke more words in a single sitting than he had managed in the entire 9 days combined. He did not lead into it. He simply said, looking at his coffee cup, without any preamble at all, "My father built this house for my mother." Winifred went still. She lasted 3 winters, Cormac continued, his voice low and even. Then she went back to her people in Tennessee. Said the mountain was too quiet. Said she couldn't hear herself think up here. He turned the cup in his hands. I was 7. The fire shifted in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees in long waves. She did not rush to fill the space he had left. She understood in that moment something about the bare walls and the folded curtains and the 2 chairs at the table and the man who had turned silence from a wound into a methodology. The mountain had given him silence when he needed something else, and so he had made silence into the only thing he knew how to offer. She understood it without saying that she understood it, which was the only way understanding of that kind is useful. After a time, she said quietly, "How old was he, your father?" Cormac looked up. The question had clearly not been asked before. 31, he said. Did he ever say much about it? After? No, Cormac said. He just worked. She nodded slowly. Sounds familiar, she said. Something moved across his face. Recognition, she thought. The specific discomfort of being seen clearly by someone who is not trying to wound you with the seeing. He stood up, took his cup to the basin, and stood there with his back to her. You haven't asked me why the others left, he said. No, she said. A pause. You're not curious. She considered that, honestly, in the way she considered most things, before answering. I think I already know, she said, and I don't think it's the reason you believe it is. He was very still for a moment. Then, without another word, he went to his room. But his lamp burned longer than usual that night, and through the thin wall she could hear him awake, not moving, not working, simply awake, in the particular way a man is awake when something he has set down a long time ago has just been quietly returned to him, and he is not yet certain whether he is ready to carry it. Winifred sat at the kitchen table a while longer, her hands around a cup that had gone cold, listening to the storm working itself out against the mountain. She thought about the notebook in the kitchen drawer. She thought about the cairn at the side of the trail. She thought about a man who left the fire banked every night so that whoever came to the stove first would not start from nothing, who had installed a lock on her door before she arrived, who spoke to frightened animals in a voice he could not seem to find for people, who had kept a set of curtains folded carefully in a trunk for years, because some part of him could not quite give up on the idea that one day there would be a reason to put them up again. She thought about a word that had been applied to her in official ink, on official paper, with official signatures. Incomplete. She looked around the kitchen at the sealed window, the straightened shelf, the curtains visible through the doorway, shifting very slightly in the warmth from the stove. She thought that perhaps 2 people who were each incomplete in different ways and in different places were not therefore insufficient. That perhaps they were instead something else entirely. The storm pressed at the glass. The lamp burned in the room next to hers. She blew out her own light and listened to the mountain settle into the deep quiet that follows when weather has finally said what it came to say. She was not going anywhere. The storm broke on the 10th morning. Winifred knew it before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence had changed overnight, gone from the dense, pressurized quiet of heavy snowfall to something cleaner and stiller, the kind of silence that follows weather the way a long exhale follows a held breath. The mountain had said what it came to say and was done with it. She dressed and came into the kitchen and stopped. The stove was already lit. Not just coals banked, not just the preparation for a fire. Actual flames, built up properly, with coffee already brewed and sitting in the pot with a folded cloth over the handle to keep it warm. She stood in the doorway and looked at the pot for a moment. Then she poured herself a cup and stood at the window and looked out at the white-covered ranch, the peaks above catching the first pale light like something just remembering how to wake up. She did not remark on the coffee when he came in from the barn an hour later, snow on his shoulders, cheeks red from the cold. She simply had breakfast waiting and let the coffee mean what it meant without making it mean anything out loud. They ate in the particular silence that had settled between them since the night of the storm, softer than before, less defended. Not warm yet, but no longer armed. Fence line on the north pasture took damage, he said midway through the meal. I'll need most of the day on it. I'll bring lunch out, she said. He looked up. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and returned to her breakfast. He left without arguing. She noticed he did not tell her which section of the north pasture, as though he had not quite decided whether he wanted to be found or had simply assumed, for the first time, that she was capable of finding him. She found him anyway. It was not difficult. She followed the fence line east from the barn until she heard the steady rhythm of a hammer against a post, and then she saw him, dark coat against the white ground, working with the concentrated precision he brought to every physical task, each movement deliberate and without excess. She came up beside him and set the lunch pail on a flat rock nearby without interrupting his work. He drove 2 more nails before he stopped and turned. He looked at the pail, then at her, then at the distance she had walked through the snow to get there. It's a long walk, he said. Yes, she agreed pleasantly. He sat on the rock beside the pail and opened it, and she stood a few feet away and looked out across the north pasture, the white ground broken only by dark fence posts and the tree line beyond. The sky so blue it almost hurt to look at directly, the particular saturated blue that only appears after mountain snow when the air has been scoured clean of everything. It's beautiful up here, she said, not to fill the silence, simply because it was true, and she saw no reason not to say true things. He chewed slowly and looked out at the same view. Most women say it's lonely, he said. Most women aren't wrong, she said. It's both. He glanced at her sideways. Something in the line of his shoulder shifted. Not dramatically. The way a door shifts when a latch is released, not yet open, but no longer held shut by force. They stayed like that for a while. The cold was sharp, but not cruel. The mountain was enormous around them and entirely indifferent. And somehow that indifference made the small, warm fact of 2 people sitting near each other feel more significant than it might have elsewhere. He finished eating and handed the pail back. Thank you, he said. It was the first time he had said those words since she arrived. She accepted the pail and turned to go, and he went back to his fence posts, and neither of them said anything else. But she was smiling by the time she rounded the tree line, and she did not try to stop it. It was 3 days after that when Gerald Finch made his visit. He came up the trail in his post wagon on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, red-faced from the cold, carrying a small packet of mail and the undisguised curiosity of a man who had forwarded 9 return letters and was quietly astonished to find no 10th one in his bag. He stayed for coffee. She poured it, and he sat at the table and talked with the comfortable fluency of a man who views conversation as a public service, which in a town the size of Grover's Bluff it arguably was. Somewhere in the middle of his talking, with the frankness of a man who has simply decided that pretending people do not talk is more dishonest than admitting that they do, he said, "I'll be straight with you, Miss Vale. The whole town had bets on you by Thursday of your first week." Winifred raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bets?" she said. "On when you'd be coming back down," Gerald said, with the grace to look at least partially abashed. She set her cup down. "What do they say now?" Gerald glanced at Cormac, who was sitting with his coffee and examining the table with the expression of a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere that did not involve being discussed. Then Gerald looked back at Winifred, and a slow grin crossed his weathered face. "Now," he said, "they don't quite know what to say." After he left, the yard settled back into its usual quiet. Cormac stood on the porch and watched the wagon descend the trail, and Winifred stood beside him, not quite touching, both of them looking out at the valley below, where the town sat small and distant under the winter sky. "Does it bother you," he asked, "that they talk?" "People talk about what they don't understand," she said. "It doesn't mean anything." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. "It used to bother me," he said slowly, as though he was examining each word before he produced it. After the second woman left, the whole county had an opinion about why. After the third, they stopped hiding the opinions. A pause. "I stopped going into town much after that." Winifred looked at his profile. The hard jaw, the careful eyes, the way he held himself like a man permanently braced for something that might or might not arrive. "What do you think it was?" she asked quietly. "Why they left?" He was still for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I think," he said finally, "that I forgot how to make room for another person. My father never learned it after my mother left." I watched him close down inch by inch until there was nothing left but the work and the land. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I told myself I wouldn't be that. And then I was exactly that. And by the time I noticed, I couldn't find the way back. She did not fill the moment with reassurance. She simply stood beside him and let the words exist in the cold air between them, solid and honest and long overdue. "You noticed," she said at last. "That's not nothing." He turned and looked at her directly. Really looked at her, in a way that was different from all the careful sideways assessments of the weeks prior, as though he had finally decided that looking was worth the risk of being seen looking. Then they went inside, and something had shifted, and the knowing of it sat in the house that evening, like a third presence, quiet and patient, waiting for them to decide what to do with it. It was on a still afternoon, 4 days later, that she followed the path. She had noticed it before, a narrow track behind the barn that veered away from the main trail and climbed slightly before disappearing into the pines. Some paths ask to be followed in their own time, and she had learned to be patient with things that were not yet ready. But that afternoon, with Cormac out on the far pasture and the light falling clean and cold through the trees, she followed it. It opened into a small clearing, perhaps 200 yards from the barn. 2 graves. The larger one had a proper headstone, well-cut granite with carved lettering. A woman's name. The dates showed she had been 26 years old. The smaller grave beside it had a simpler marker, a flat piece of pale stone, with letters carved less professionally, carved by someone without a stonemason's skill, but with a stonemason's care. It read, "Son of C.H. March, 1876. No given name, just that. son of CH and the month and the year and nothing else. Winifred stood in the clearing for a long time. She heard him behind her before she heard his footsteps. There was a change in the air, the particular change that happens when someone you have become attuned to enters the space you are in. She did not turn around immediately. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. "You didn't," he said. His voice was different here. Not softer exactly, but less defended. As though this particular ground had its own rules, and he had long since stopped trying to enforce the usual ones here. She turned then. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, hat in his hands, looking at the smaller stone. "Your wife," she said, "and your son." "Fever," he said. "The winter of '76 was hard, and it came early. I went down to the valley for medicine. The trail took longer than it should have. When I came back," he stopped. His hands were still on his hat. "She had been gone 12 hours by the time I got through." The pines were very quiet around them. Somewhere far above, wind moved through the upper branches, a sound like breathing. "Did you name him?" she asked. "Your son." He was quiet for long enough that she thought the question had been too much. Then he said, in a voice that was rough at the edges in a way she had not heard before, "No, I couldn't. If I named him, it meant I had to believe it was real. It seemed like it shouldn't be real." He paused. "I know that doesn't make sense." "It makes complete sense," she said. She moved to stand beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough that he would know she was there. She looked at the small stone with its carefully carved letters. "He was real, whether you named him or not," she said quietly. "But I understand why it mattered." Cormac looked at the stone for a long time. Then he looked at her, and she saw in his face the particular loneliness of a pain that has been carried alone for so long it has become indistinguishable from the person carrying it. She did not try to take it from him. She simply stood beside him until he was ready to walk back, and then they walked back together without speaking. But that evening at dinner, something was different between them. The weight of having been trusted with something that does not get shown to most people. That night, by the stove, she told him about Philadelphia. She had not planned to. But the evening had the quality of certain evenings, those rare ones where the hour and the fire and the particular quality of the quiet create something that feels safe enough for truth. And she found that she wanted him to know. Not because she needed him to, but because it seemed, after what he had shown her in the clearing, like the honest thing to do. "My former husband said I was incomplete," she said, looking at the fire. "When the marriage ended, he chose a version of events that was convenient for him. And the church council chose the same version because it was easier than the alternative." She paused. "My employer at the time, a man named Harcourt, had been falsifying the company ledgers. I found it. He accused me of the theft before I could say anything about his. The settlement went in his favor because he was the man and I was the employee, and that was how those things went." She looked at her hands. "I lost the position. I lost the reputation. My husband used it as the reason he had been looking for. The council wrote a document. I burned it before I left." She said all of it quietly and without drama, the way she tended to say things that had cost her. Cormac had not moved while she spoke. He was looking at her now with an expression that was entirely unguarded, the walls simply not up, as though they had been set aside somewhere along the course of this particular evening. "The man who wrote that document," he said, Was he someone you respected once? I thought I was, she said. I think he always thought less of me than I understood. Then his opinion was always worth less than you gave it, Cormac said. What he wrote was always wrong. It was wrong before he wrote it. She looked at him. 3 sentences. No rhetorical flourish. No performance of comfort. Just the plain, direct assessment of a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing beyond it, offered without expectation of response, as simple and unadorned as everything else he did. She felt those 3 sentences settle somewhere in her chest in a way that a great deal of far more elaborate sympathy had never managed to reach. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and looked back at the fire. He stood eventually to take his cup to the basin. "Freddie," he said, with his back still partially to her. It was the first time he had used her name, her given name, or the shortened version of it that she had always preferred, that she had told him on the first day in the same breath as her full name, not expecting he would use it. The word in his voice was careful, as though he had been holding it for a while, and was uncertain of the weight. She looked up. He seemed to think better of whatever he had been going to say, or perhaps he had said the thing he intended to say, which was the name itself, and nothing more was needed. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Cormac," she said. He went to his room. The lamp under his door burned for a long time. She stayed by the fire a while longer, her hands around a cup that had gone cold. She thought about the ledger on the shelf in the supply room, about the numbers she had read and the shape of the thing she had begun to see in them, about Aldous Vane, who had come up the trail with a pleasant face and a careful question about water rights, who had looked at her the way men look at variables they are calculating. She thought about the clause she had noticed on the 3rd reading of the loan document, the one that specified conditions under which the full balance could be called due immediately. She had not said anything about it yet. She was not finished reading. She wanted to understand the whole shape of it before she said anything. The fire burned low. She banked the coals and went to bed. The days between Gerald's visit and the discovery of the path were not eventless. They were simply full of the small things that accumulate unannounced into something larger. She found on a Tuesday afternoon, when the wind came from the north and the cold had a particular edge to it, that Cormac had repaired the soft floorboard near the front door without telling her. She had mentioned it exactly once on her second morning, while cataloging the house's needs in her own mind. She had not said it to him. She had said it aloud, quietly, to herself, the way a person sometimes thinks out loud when they believe they are alone. Apparently, she had not been entirely alone. She stood on the repaired board and felt it solid underfoot, and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. He had also, at some point she could not identify, oiled the hinges on the supply room door, which had developed a creak significant enough to announce her presence every time she retrieved the ledger. The creak was gone. No mention was made of it. The silence around these small acts of attention had begun to feel, she thought, less like withholding and more like a form of communication that operated below the level of words. She understood by this point that Cormac Halstead did not say things. He did things, and the things he did were what he was saying, and you had to pay attention at all times or you would miss the conversation entirely. She was paying attention. One evening, toward the end of the 2nd week of November, she came in from bringing the last of the hanging wash inside before the night frost set it stiff, and found that the kitchen lamp had been moved to the table and positioned so that the light fell more directly onto the work surface where she tended to read. It had been in the window before. A small adjustment. The kind of adjustment a person makes when they have noticed that someone does a particular thing in a particular place and would benefit from better light to do it by. She set the wash down and looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she sat down and opened the ledger and let the better light do what it had been arranged to do. That night at supper she said, passing the bread, "The lamp is better where you moved it." He looked up from his plate. "The angle from the window made shadows on the table," he said. "Yes," she said. "I noticed." A pause. He returned to his plate. But she had the impression, watching the particular stillness of a man who is trying not to show that he has been caught doing something kind, that he was slightly less composed than usual. She did not pursue it. She had learned that pursuing these moments was the surest way to end them. The November cold deepened in the week before Gerald's visit, and with it came a kind of enforced proximity that neither of them had yet had occasion to navigate. The outdoor work contracted to what was strictly necessary. The days grew short enough that the hours after supper stretched out in the lamplight, longer than they had been when the evenings could still be occupied outside. He did not retreat entirely. That was the thing she noted most carefully. In those first days, the end of the meal had been his signal to leave. Now he stayed. Not for long. Not with conversation, but present at the table or near the stove, in the particular way of a man who has decided that another person's company, while not a thing he has practiced recently, is not a thing he wishes to be without. She read when she could. She mended. Once she sketched the property map from memory, checking her accuracy against the original on the wall, and he watched her do it for a while without comment, and then went back to his accounts, and she thought that was its own kind of conversation too. In the morning, she returned the ledger to its shelf and retrieved instead the loan document that had been filed beneath it. She brought it to the kitchen table and read it through twice more, slowly, with the attention she had once brought to Harcourt's books. Then she sat for a long while with her hands flat on the table and the document in front of her, looking at a specific clause in the lower section of the second page, and understanding, with the cold and particular clarity of a person who has just seen the shape of something they had hoped was not the shape it turned out to be, what Aldous Vane was actually doing. It was not simply a debt. It was a mechanism. She did not say anything that evening. She needed one more thing confirmed before she could say it with the precision it required. But she put the document away with care, in a place she would be able to find it quickly. And she went to bed that night with the specific alertness of someone who has identified a problem and is already, without making a performance of it, working on what comes next. Across the hall, Cormac Halstead's lamp burned late again. Outside, the first hard frost of November was laying itself across the meadow grass and the fence posts and the cleared path between the house and the barn, making everything glitter and still, the way the world sometimes does when it is preparing, slowly and without announcement, for what comes next. December came to Grover's Bluff the way it always came to High Country, not gradually, but all at once, as though the mountain had been waiting for a signal and then acted on it without hesitation. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in a single night. The creek at the lower pasture froze from the banks inward. The cattle moved closer to the barn without being told. Winifred noticed that Cormac had begun, in the weeks since the storm, to linger at the table after meals. Not long. 5 minutes, sometimes 10. He did not fill the time with conversation. He simply stayed, his hands around his cup, present in a way he had not been in those first days when the meal ending was always his first opportunity to leave. She treated it as ordinary because she understood that the moment it was remarked upon, it would become something that required a decision, and decisions frightened him in ways that actions did not. She had also, quietly and without announcement, finished reading every document in the supply room shelf. She knew the full shape of it now. Aldous Vane had not simply offered a loan to a man in a difficult season. He had spent 3 years before that buying up the debt of every small property holder along the Northern Trail corridor, the Pembroke family, the Dutton brothers, old Hartwell, who ran cattle on the Eastern Ridge. He had done it quietly, through a land-holding company registered in Denver whose name appeared nowhere on the individual loan documents. He had waited for the drought of 1881, which anyone paying attention to the patterns of the land could have predicted would come, and when it came, he had been ready with money and terms that looked reasonable in a crisis and were devastating on examination. The Northern Trail corridor was the only viable commercial route to the Upper Valley settlements. Whoever controlled the land along it controlled the access. The ranch held the highest and most strategically positioned section. Without it, the corridor was incomplete. With it, Vane would have everything he needed. The loan document's acceleration clause was written in language designed to be overlooked. Buried in the third section, following 2 paragraphs of standard terms that would cause any reader to relax their attention, it stated that the full balance became immediately due and payable upon determination by the lender that the property demonstrated insufficient operational capacity, a phrase with no legal definition, no measurable standard, no objective criteria. It meant whatever Vane chose it to mean, whenever he chose it to mean it. There was a second clause in the 4th section which she had read 3 times to be certain she understood it correctly. Under the Married Women's Property Act passed by the Colorado legislature in 1879, a married woman's assets and her husband's property held jointly were protected from certain categories of unilateral debt action. The clause in the loan document explicitly specified that its terms applied to unmarried property holders only. Vane knew about the act. He had written around it deliberately, which meant he had made the loan knowing that Cormac was unmarried, and he had timed his acceleration of it to occur before that changed. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she said anything. On the 3rd day, she brought the document to the table after supper and set it in front of Cormac without preamble. "There's something in here you need to see," she said, and sat down across from him. He read where she pointed. Then he read the surrounding section. Then he set the document down and looked at her. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've been certain for 2 days. She said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He was quiet for a moment, not the retreating quiet, but the quiet of a man absorbing something he has suspected in a general way and is now confronting in a specific one. "The other properties," he said. "Pembroke, the Duttons." "All of them," she said. "He holds all of them, through a company in Denver. The names don't match, but the document structure does. Same clause language, same formation dates, same notary seal." He looked at the document again. His jaw was set. "He'll come before the end of the month," Cormac said. "He always has a reason." "Yes," she said. "I think so too." She watched him sit with it, the full weight of what he was looking at. Not just a debt, but a design. Not just financial pressure, but a patient and deliberate strategy built on knowing that a man isolated by grief and habit and 6 years of progressively narrowing his world would not have someone beside him who knew how to read what was being done to him. What Vane had not accounted for was her. Vane came on the 14th of December. He came with a lawyer this time, a thin man from Pueblo named Greer, who carried a leather case and had the expression of a man who has made peace with being the instrument of other people's intentions. He came also with 2 witnesses she did not recognize, men from the valley who stood to one side and said nothing and looked at the ground. Cormac met them in the yard. Winifred stood at the porch. Vane was pleasant. He was always pleasant. Pleasantness was the instrument he had sharpened over years, and he used it with the precision of a craftsman. "I'm afraid this is unavoidable, Cormac," he said, in the tone of a man who has thought carefully about how to sound regretful. The assessment of the operational capacity, given the losses of the past season and the current outstanding balance, requires that we discuss immediate settlement. Mr. Greer has the formal notice. Greer opened his case and produced a document. 30 days, Greer said, in a voice calibrated to convey that 30 days was a generosity rather than a constraint. Cormac took the document and read it. His face did not change. She had learned to read what his face not changing meant. It meant he was working to keep it that way. Vane looked at Winifred then, with the expression of a man performing consideration. "I am sorry, Mrs. Halstead," he said. "I know the timing is difficult." "I am not Mrs. Halstead," Winifred said. Her voice was level. "We are not yet married." Something moved in Vane's eyes. It was not surprise. It was the small, controlled satisfaction of a man whose calculation has just been confirmed. "Ah," he said. "I see." He paused 1 beat longer than necessary. "Well, I hope the situation resolves itself in time." He said it kindly, which was the most precise way he could have said it to convey that he knew it would not. After they left, the yard was very quiet. Cormac stood at the fence line with the document in his hand and did not speak for a long time. 30 days, he said finally. "I don't have it. Not in 30 days. "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Not the careful blankness, not the guarded assessment. The look of a man who has been working toward something and has just watched the ground shift beneath it. She went inside and put the kettle on, because there was nothing useful to say in that moment, and hot coffee was at least something real. That evening, Gerald Finch came up the trail, his face carrying the expression of a man who has heard something and is not an unkind person. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and did not pretend that the timing of his visit was coincidental. "The Pembrokes lost their deed last spring," he said, looking at his cup. "The Duttons signed over in July. Hartwell held on longest. He signed in October." He paused. "Folks in town know what Vane is doing. They just don't know how to stop it." "He's been patient about it," Gerald continued. "Never rushed. Never gave anyone cause to take it to a judge. Just waited until people were tired enough and scared enough to sign." He left after an hour, and the house was quiet again. She went to the supply room and retrieved the loan document and the Denver company registration she had requested from the county office 3 weeks prior under the pretext of researching adjacent property lines. She had paid for the search herself, from the small savings accumulated over years of careful living that Edmund had not known about, because she had always understood, in some part of herself that was wiser than the rest, that a woman needed to keep something her own. She spread the documents on the kitchen table and read them again in the lamplight. The next morning, the letter arrived. Gerald brought it on his regular run, handing it to her at the door with an expression that told her he knew what it was before she did. It was from her brother, Nathaniel, in Philadelphia. His handwriting on the envelope was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a man composing himself before saying something difficult. She opened it at the kitchen table and read it twice. Harcourt was dead. A heart complaint, sudden, in November. His son and heir, a young man apparently of more conscience than his father, had engaged a solicitor to review the company's outstanding legal matters, and the matter of Winifred Vale was among them. The accusation, the solicitor had determined, was without merit. There was a formal offer of retraction. There was the possibility of partial restitution. Nathaniel had written the rest carefully. He was not a man who stated things bluntly, but the meaning underneath his careful words was plain enough. She could come home. The door that had been closed against her in Philadelphia was open. Her name could be cleared. Her reputation restored, at least in part, in the place where reputation had once mattered to her more than almost anything. She had to return before the end of January to sign the necessary documents. The offer would not remain open indefinitely. She sat with the letter for a long time. Cormac came in for the midday meal, and she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in his coat. She watched his face while he read. He read it through twice. Then he set it on the counter and looked at it rather than at her. He was quiet for so long that the kettle began to whistle, and she moved to take it off the heat without either of them acknowledging the sound. "This is what you left behind," he said finally. His voice was carefully even, the particular evenness of a man who is maintaining something by effort. "Your name, your standing, the thing that was taken from you." "Yes," she said. "You should go," he said. The words were simple. 4 words. She heard the weight underneath all 4 of them. "You're telling me to leave," she said. "I'm telling you that you deserve to choose," he said. "You came here because you had no good choices. Now you have one. You should take it." She looked at him for a long moment. He was still looking at the letter on the counter, not at her. She could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the posture she had come to know as the one he adopted when he was holding something in rather than letting it out. She saw what he was not saying. She was quite sure she saw it clearly. And she saw, underneath that, the thing that made what he was not saying so costly. The last time he had wanted someone to stay, he had gone down the mountain for medicine and come back to find them gone in the most permanent way that a person can go. He had made himself into a man who did not ask people to stay. He had made it a principle of his life, this refusal to ask, this insistence that the choice belonged entirely to the other person. She understood that. She respected it. She also thought it was the most painful thing she had ever watched a person do. She took the letter and folded it and put it in her pocket. And they finished the meal in a silence that was weighted and unresolved and full of things that had not been said. That night, after he had gone to bed, she took the trunk from under the bed and set it on the mattress. She opened it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took out the first thing she had packed when she arrived in October, a wool shawl, dark green, the one she had worn on the stage coming west. She folded it. She set it inside the trunk. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, not crying, just breathing, the way a person breathes when they are trying to think clearly, and the thinking is very hard. Ruth Hatfield arrived mid-morning the following day, her wagon coming up the trail with the purposeful pace of a woman who has heard something and decided to act on it. She found Winifred in the bedroom with the trunk on the bed and said nothing about it for a full minute. Then she went to the barn. Nobody recorded what she said to Cormac in there, but when she came back out, her expression was that of a woman who has said what needed saying and is satisfied that it landed. She declined coffee, climbed back onto her wagon, and drove back down the mountain without another word. Cormac came in for supper that evening and sat down across from Winifred and ate his meal. But she noticed that he did not look at the counter where the letter had been. She noticed that his hands, usually steady, moved once around his coffee cup with something that was not quite stillness. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and thought with the same focused attention she brought to ledgers and legal documents, trying to see the whole shape of the thing clearly. The ranch at stake. The corridor Vane intended to control. The Pembrooks, the Duttons, Hartwell, all of them already lost. The loan document with its carefully constructed clause. The acceleration notice sitting on the kitchen counter. 30 days. And alongside all of that, the letter from Nathaniel. Philadelphia. The retraction. Her name. The silence of the house in those hours was not the comfortable silence she had come to know. It had the quality of something that had been stretched and had not yet snapped back into its usual shape. She moved through it carefully, the way you move through a room you know well when all the furniture has been shifted. She had thought, in the weeks since November, that she understood what she was doing here. Not just the practical work of the house and the ledgers and the slow, incremental business of two people learning how to share a space without damaging each other. She had thought she understood why she had come, what she had decided when she burned that letter, what the decision had cost, and what it had given her back. She found, lying in the dark, that she had not entirely understood. That there was something she had not quite counted on, which was the particular quality of wanting a life you had not permitted yourself to want. She had come here as a practical choice, made by a practical woman in difficult circumstances. She had told herself, and had largely believed, that what developed between her and this guarded, solitary man was something she was witnessing and assessing rather than something she was inside of. She looked at the ceiling and thought about the documents on the kitchen table. She thought about the loan agreement with its carefully constructed trap. She thought about the letter from Nathaniel folded on the counter, the door it represented, the reputation it offered, the life in Philadelphia that was suddenly, unexpectedly available again. She thought, I could go back. I could sign the documents and let Harcourt's son clear my name and return to a city where I am known, where I have a history, where I was someone before any of this happened, she thought, and leave this ranch to be taken by a man who has been patient and deliberate and entirely indifferent to the lives he is dismantling, piece by piece, for the sake of a road, she thought, and leave this man who leaves fires banked and lamps positioned for better light and floors repaired when he overhears someone cataloging what needs doing, who spoke to a frightened calf with a patience he cannot seem to locate for people, who said your opinion was always wrong and meant it as comfort, and was right. She sat with all of this for a long time. She thought about a word, incomplete. She had turned that word over for months. She turned it over now one more time, in the dark of a December morning on a mountain in Colorado, and found that it had lost most of its weight. Not because the circumstances that had produced it had changed, But because she had sat in this kitchen for weeks and done work that mattered, and found things that needed finding, and stood beside a man at a grave and been trusted with something that does not get shown to most people, and the word no longer had purchase on the person she currently was. She thought, if I leave, who will read the documents? Who will notice the date discrepancy? Who will cross-reference the filing numbers? Who will sit in the early morning cold and find the thing that was designed not to be found? She thought, not him. Not because he is not capable, but because it has not occurred to him that someone capable would stay long enough to bother. She thought, that is exactly the problem, and I am the only person who knows enough of both sides of it to do anything about it. Just before the early hours of the morning, when the cold was at its deepest and the mountain was at its most absolute silence, she got up. She put on her wrapper and took the lamp to the kitchen table and retrieved the loan document from where she had filed it. She read the acceleration clause again. She read the property protection clause again. She read the Denver company registration again. And then, because she had been reading documents long enough to know that the answer was usually somewhere in the document you were already holding, she read the entire loan document again from the beginning. She found it in the 5th section. She had read it before. She had noted it as standard language and moved past it. But sitting here in the early morning cold, with the lamp making a small warm circle on the table, and the ranch silent around her, she read it again and saw what she had moved past too quickly. The acceleration clause required documentation, a formal assessment filed with the county land office, signed by a licensed assessor. Not just Vane's determination. A documented, filed, official assessment. She sat up straighter. She went to the county registration documents. She looked at the dates. The assessments on the other properties had been filed by the same man, a licensed assessor from Pueblo named Ferris. She found his name on 3 separate documents. She found his name on the documents in Cormac's file as well. Vane had already commissioned an assessment. It had been filed at the county land office in October, before Vane had come to the ranch the first time, before she had arrived. She read the assessment. It was not accurate. It was not even close to accurate. The operational losses it cited were inflated by a factor that no honest assessor would have reached. The methodology was structured to produce a conclusion rather than find one. She had seen this kind of document before in Harcourt's books, the same architecture. Numbers arranged to tell a predetermined story. She sat back. She looked at the filing date on Vane's assessment. She looked at the date stamp on the county registration copy. Then she looked at the date on the original loan document. The date Vane claimed it had been signed. She looked at it for a long time. She set it beside the county copy. The dates did not match. The original loan document bore a date 3 weeks earlier than the county registration copy. 3 weeks earlier than was legally possible, because the county office stamp predated the date on the loan document's own signature page by 18 days, which meant that the county copy had been filed before the document it was supposed to be a copy of had been signed, which meant that someone had altered the date on one of them after the fact. She knew, without having to reason further, which one had been altered. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark hours of a December morning and looked at the documents spread in front of her. Her lamp burned steadily. The house was very still. She thought about Cormac asleep in the room across the hall, carrying his carefully maintained belief that he could not ask anyone to stay, that the choosing had to be left entirely to other people, that this was the form of love available to a man who had lost too much to risk wanting anything openly. She thought about Philadelphia, about a retraction signed by a dead man's son, about a reputation restored in a city she had left. She thought about a word burned to ash in a tin waste bin in a rented room, about a brass key on a nightstand that she had never used because she had never needed to, about cornbread eaten without a word left on the plate, about a name said carefully, as though it had been held for a while before being offered. She looked at the documents on the table. Then she got up, put more wood on the fire, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat back down. She had work to do. She worked until the light came, not quickly. She worked the way she did everything that mattered, with patience and precision and the specific kind of focus that had once made her indispensable to a man who then spent considerable effort pretending she had never been. She laid the documents out in order. She made notes in the margin of her own paper, cross-referencing dates and filing numbers and assessor signatures. She wrote nothing she could not prove and set aside everything she could not yet verify. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window had gone from black to the deep blue-gray of early mountain morning, she had what she needed. The date discrepancy was not subtle once you knew to look for it. The county copy of the loan document had been filed on a date that preceded the signature date on the original by 18 days. That was not a clerical error. A clerical error produces a transposition, a wrong digit, an inverted number. It does not produce an impossibility. A document cannot be registered as a copy before the original exists to be copied from. The assessment filed by Ferris contained 3 specific valuations she could disprove with the ranch's own ledger records, numbers that Cormac had kept accurately and consistently for years, the kind of records that did not lie because they had been made with no audience in mind. The hay yield figures Ferris cited were less than half the actual harvest documented in August. The cattle count was short by 31 head. The water rights valuation was based on a survey that had been superseded by the county reassessment of 1880, a public record she had found reference to in the county registration file. 3 provable inaccuracies in a formal filed assessment, combined with a date impossibility in the core loan document. She wrote it all out cleanly in the measured, precise hand she had developed over years of work that required clarity above all else. She made 2 copies. Then she went to wake Cormac. She knocked at his door at 5:30. He was already awake. She could tell by the quality of the silence on the other side, the alert stillness of a man who has been lying in the dark, thinking rather than sleeping. "I need you to come to the kitchen," she said through the door. "There's something you need to see before the day starts." He came out in 2 minutes, dressed, his face carrying the careful composure he put on each morning, like his coat. He looked at her standing in the kitchen doorway with the lamp and the documents, and something shifted in his expression before he could prevent it. She showed him everything. She walked him through it methodically, pointing to the dates, to the figures, to the cross-references in the ledger that disproved Ferris's assessment line by line. She did not editorialize. She did not tell him what it meant. She let the documents speak in the language they spoke, which was plain enough for anyone willing to read them honestly. He was very quiet for a long time when she finished. "How long have you had this?" he asked. "The date discrepancy I found this morning," she said. "The assessment errors I've known about for 10 days. I waited until I had both before I said anything." He looked at the documents spread on the kitchen table. Then he looked at her, and she saw in his face the particular expression of a man who is confronting something he does not quite have a category for. the experience of being known in a way he had not expected and had not prepared a defense against. "You've been doing this," he said slowly, "since the day he first came up the trail." "I do what I know how to do," she said simply. He was quiet again. Then he said, "We need Gerald." "Yes," she said, "and we need the county land office, and we need to go today." They went that morning. Gerald Finch received them in the post office with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular piece of news and is cautiously hopeful about what he is seeing in the faces of the people delivering it. Winifred set the documents on his counter and explained what she had found. Gerald listened without interrupting, which for Gerald represented a significant exercise of restraint. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The filing dates. You're certain?" "The county stamp is on the document," she said. "It's not an interpretation. It's a date." Gerald looked at Cormac. Cormac said nothing, but the quality of his silence was different from his usual silences. It had something in it that she had not heard before, something that might, in another man, have been called relief. The county land office was at the far end of Main Street, a narrow building with a territorial flag above the door that had faded to a pale suggestion of its original colors. The clerk, a young man named Aldridge, who wore his responsibility with the particular seriousness of someone recently appointed to it, examined the documents Winifred laid before him with the focused attention of a person who understood that he was looking at something that required care. He compared the filing dates. He compared the signatures. He pulled the original registration ledger from the shelf behind his desk and checked the entry himself. Then he looked up. "This is a material discrepancy," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Winifred said. "The assessment figures," he said, going back to her notes. "These are contradicted by the ranch records?" "By 3 years of consistent ledger entries made with no knowledge of the assessment," she said. "I can provide the original ledgers. The records are Cormac's. He kept them himself." Aldridge sat back in his chair and looked at the documents for a long moment. "I'll need to hold these," he said, "and I'll need to contact the State Land Commissioner's office in Denver." He paused. "This will take some days to process formally, but in the meantime," he looked at Cormac, "the acceleration notice issued under this document is stayed pending investigation of the document's validity. I'll put that in writing this afternoon." The room was very quiet. Cormac stood beside her and said nothing, but she felt, rather than saw, the change in him. The thing that had been held rigid for so long releasing by one small increment, the way ice at the edge of a river gives way in early spring, not all at once, but steadily, because the season has made holding together no longer necessary. Aldous Vane was located at the Grover's Bluff Hotel, where he had taken a room in anticipation of what he had expected to be a straightforward conclusion to a straightforward process. He was informed of the stay by Aldridge himself, with Gerald Finch present as witness, in the hotel lobby in front of 3 men who had nothing particular to do that morning, but who found, nonetheless, that they had reason to be in the lobby at that specific time. Vane received the information with the composure of a man who has been genuinely surprised but has enough experience to know that composure in public is always the correct response. He thanked Aldridge for the notification. He said he was confident the matter would be resolved satisfactorily. He left Grover's Bluff that afternoon. Winifred did not watch him go. She was at the counter of the dry goods store buying seed packets, spring varieties, because it was December and spring was a long way off, and she had found, over the course of recent weeks, that she had opinions about what should grow along the front of the porch when the season came for it. The formal investigation concluded 3 weeks later. A letter arrived from the State Land Commissioner's office in Denver, addressed to Cormac Halstead and copied to the county clerk. The language was official and measured and said, in its careful way, that the loan instrument had been found to contain material irregularities that rendered its acceleration clause unenforceable. The assessor Ferris had his license suspended pending a broader review of his filed assessments. The Denver Land Holding Company registered to Vane's interests was under examination. Cormac read the letter at the kitchen table. Then he set it down and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Winifred poured coffee and sat across from him and waited. "The Pembrooks," he said finally. "The Duttons." "Aldridge said the review would cover the other properties too," she said. "I don't know what it will mean for them, but it means something." He was quiet again. Then he said in a voice that had a roughness to it that had nothing to do with the cold, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "Your ledgers were accurate. That mattered more than anything I found." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, the same lamp she had moved to give her better light, the same lamp he had moved to give her better light, and it burned steadily in the December morning and made the kitchen look the way a kitchen is supposed to look. "I have not," he said slowly, "in a long time, had someone beside me." He stopped. His jaw was set in the particular way it went when he was saying something that cost him. I had forgotten what it was like to have someone who was. On the same side. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about how many of them were unnecessary. "I know," she said simply. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They drank in the silence that had become, over the course of this mountain winter, one of the most comfortable places she had ever been. In the days that followed, something eased in him that she had not quite realized was still clenched. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation or a revelation. It was more like watching ice in a creek at the end of winter, the way it does not melt all at once but goes gradually, incrementally, in the places where the current is strongest until one morning you look and the water is simply moving freely and you cannot remember exactly when it changed. He began, with some effort and occasional backsliding, to use her name more often. He began to stay at the table after the evening meal not just for minutes but for the better part of an hour, talking in the spare, careful way that was the most he could do and more than she had expected. He told her once, without preamble, that he had decided to plant the south field with winter wheat the following season and wanted her opinion on the timing, and she had given it. And he had listened with the concentrated attention of a man who is not accustomed to asking questions and has not yet decided how he feels about the fact that he keeps finding them worth asking. She thought, watching him across the supper table on an evening in early January when the snow was deep and the mountain was at its most itself, and the curtains she had hung moved gently in the draught from the window she had sealed with her thumb on her third day, that she had not been wrong about him. That the thing she had seen in those first days underneath all that rigid silence had been real and not a projection of her own wishes. That a person who carries grief the way he carried it, not on the surface, but distributed through the whole structure of the self, does not become easy to know, but that knowing them, when you have the patience for it, is not something that can be compared to easier things. She thought, "I came here because I had no good choices. I am staying because I have made one." That was different. That was the most different thing. When they rode back up the mountain that afternoon, the valley below them was pale gold in the winter light, the town small and distant and entirely ordinary, going about its business the way small towns do, which is to say, continuously and without much regard for the large things happening quietly inside the lives of the people who make it up. Halfway up the trail, at the section where the road curved and the view opened briefly before the pines closed in again, Cormac stopped the wagon. There was no practical reason to stop there. The horses did not need rest. The road was clear. He simply stopped and sat, and looked out at the valley for a moment. The valley below was laid out in the winter light, the town of Grover's Bluff sitting in its cup of land between the ridges, the buildings small and distinct from this height, the smoke rising straight up from the chimneys in the still air. She had come down that trail into that town 3 months before, carrying a trunk and a name on a piece of paper, and a word that had been applied to her in official ink, and that she had been trying to set down ever since. She looked at the town and thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage on a cold Tuesday morning, and felt the mountain air hit her face and breathed it in. She thought, that woman was not wrong about anything. She was just not yet finished. Then he said, without looking at her, "I told you to leave." "You told me I deserved to choose," she said. "It was the same thing." "It was not the same thing," she said quietly. "Not even close." He was still looking at the valley. The light was going, the winter sun dropping fast behind the western ridge, the shadows lengthening across the snow. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It was the most undefended thing she had heard him say. More undefended than the story about his father. More undefended than the cleared throat beside the graves. Simply a man stating a true thing, with no attempt to make it sound like anything other than what it was. "I know," she said. "I'm going to do it wrong." "Probably," she agreed. "So will I." He looked at her then, the full looking, the kind she had seen only a few times, that had no wall behind it. "I want you to stay," he said. "I should have said it before you packed that trunk. I should have said it before Vane came up the trail. I should have." He stopped. His jaw was set. "I want you to stay, Freddie. That's what's true. Everything else I said was me trying to give you a choice I didn't actually want you to take." The mountain was very quiet around them. She looked at him for a long moment, this reserved and careful and deeply lonely man who had spent 6 years turning his pain into architecture, who kept a notebook he couldn't throw away and a set of curtains he couldn't quite give up on, who had installed a lock on her door before she arrived and left the fire banked every morning and eaten every bite of cornbread without knowing why it moved him, who had moved a lamp and oiled a hinge and repaired a floor because he had overheard her noting what needed doing and had not known any other way to say what he was saying. "I know," she said. "I knew when you said it." "And you stayed anyway?" "I stayed because I chose to," she said. "Not because you asked me to. That's the only way it means anything." He was quiet. The horses shifted. The last of the light caught in the snow and made it briefly gold before the ridge swallowed the sun and the valley went to blue and gray. "All right," he said. Then, after a moment, "Philadelphia is not where I live," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and something settled in his face, not the careful composure she had first seen, but something more permanent and less defended than that. The expression of a man who has stopped bracing for something and started, with full knowledge of the cost and the risk, choosing it instead. Then he picked up the reins, and the wagon moved forward up the trail, and the pines closed in around them, and the ranch appeared ahead around the long curve in the road, solid and waiting, the windows dark but not empty. They were married on the last Saturday in January 1883. The ceremony was held in the Grover's Bluff Church, which was small enough that the dozen people who attended filled it without crowding. Gerald Finch stood as witness and shook Cormac's hand afterward with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting to do so for some time. Ruth Hatfield cried with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a woman who has lived long enough to know that some moments are worth crying at, and this was one of them. The Aldridge boy from the county land office came, which surprised her, and stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who feels that the resolution of a particular injustice warrants bearing witness in person. Cormac stood at the front of the church and watched Winifred walk toward him with the expression of a man using every resource available to him to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. His jaw was set. His hands were still, but his eyes were entirely undone, and she thought that was all right. She thought that some things should get past the wall, and this was one of them, and she was glad it did. She had worn the dark green wool shawl, the one she had taken from the trunk in the dark of the December bedroom and folded and set inside, and then sat on the edge of the bed with her face in her hands, not crying, just breathing. She had taken it back out the morning of the wedding and put it on, and it was the right thing to wear, and she knew it, the way she knew certain things, simply and without uncertainty. When she reached him, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You could have left." "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't." The Reverend spoke. They answered when required. Cormac's voice, when he made his promises, was low and deliberate, and without any hesitation at all. The voice of a man who has waited a long time to mean something completely and has finally been given the occasion for it. She wrote to Nathaniel the following week. She told him she was glad Harcourt's son had found his conscience, and that she wished him well with it. She told him the retraction was welcome, but that she found she did not need it in the way she had once thought she would. She had cleared her own name in December, she wrote, in a county land office in Colorado, using the same skills that had made her valuable to Harcourt and that he had tried to use against her. She did not require his son's signature to confirm what she already knew about herself. She paused with the pen over the paper for a moment before she sealed it. She thought about what she was not saying in the letter, which was that the clearing of her name in Philadelphia felt, at this distance, like a small and particular thing, the resolution of a chapter she had already finished reading. That what had happened in this house, on this mountain, over the course of a single winter, felt like something else entirely, something she did not yet have words for, and was not sure words were the right instrument for anyway. She sealed the letter and gave it to Gerald on his next run down the mountain. Then she went back inside and took the small notebook from the kitchen drawer. She held it for a moment. She thought about the woman who had written in it, who had learned this kitchen the same way she had learned it, through use, through the particular knowledge that comes from doing a thing many times in a specific place until the place becomes inseparable from the doing, who had noted the altitude adjustments in the margin because she understood that the same recipe behaves differently up here, that you have to account for where you are, who had written a name on the last page and then drawn a line through it and kept the book anyway. She thought, she was real. She was here before me, and she was real, and she mattered. And the fact that I am here does not diminish that. And the fact that she is gone does not diminish this." Then she carried the notebook to Cormac, who was at the table with his account books, and set it in front of him without speaking. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I found it in the drawer when I first arrived," she said. "I want you to know that I kept her recipes. I wrote them in my own book so you can have this one back." He was very still. "The remedies, too," she said. She knew what she was doing. "The willow bark ratio is exactly right." He looked at the notebook for a long time. Something moved across his face, not the small controlled adjustment she had learned to recognize as his version of feeling, but something larger and less managed, the real thing underneath the version. Not grief, exactly. Something more complex than grief. The particular emotion of a man who has been holding two true things separately and has just been given, quietly and without ceremony, permission to let them exist in the same place. He put his hand on the notebook. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She nodded and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked out at the yard, the barn, the woodpile stacked with its characteristic precision, the fence line Cormac had repaired in the snow on the morning after the storm, the cleared path between the house and the barn that he kept clear, not because it was a task on any list, but because it was the path between where he worked and where she was. She thought about a word. Incomplete. She thought, there is not a word for what this is, what has been built in this house through the winter. What exists now between this man and this woman who came to each other damaged in different ways and in different places, and found that the particular shape of one incompleteness fit, in some not entirely explicable fashion, against the particular shape of the other. She thought, perhaps that is all right. Perhaps not everything requires a word. Perhaps some things are better understood by what they produce than by what they can be called. What they produced was this: a kitchen where the lamp was positioned for the person who read, a supply room whose hinges did not announce her, a floorboard that was solid, a set of curtains that had been waiting in a trunk for years for someone to decide they were needed. A notebook returned to the man who had kept it because he could not bring himself not to. A brass key on a nightstand that had never been needed. What they produced was a man who sat on a porch step in the spring because there was a person there, and that was reason enough. She turned away from the window and went back to her work. Spring came late to Grover's Bluff that year, still showing its teeth well into April before it finally relented. But when it came completely, the way things do when they have been held back long enough. The meadow grass returning green and certain, the creek running fast with snowmelt, the sky clearing to that impossible blue that made the world look like it had been made fresh. The winter had not been easy. The cold had been severe and long, and there had been a stretch in February when the cattle required tending around the clock, and she had worked alongside Cormac through 2 nights without either of them suggesting that she might not. She had learned over those nights that there is a particular quality to work done alongside someone in difficult conditions that bypasses most of the careful architecture of human relationship and deposits you somewhere further along than you would otherwise have arrived. They had been, by the end of the second night, easy with each other in a way that the careful, incremental progress of the previous months had not quite achieved. Not because the nights had been romantic, which they had not, but because they had been real in a way that ordinary days are sometimes not, and realness has a tendency to dissolve the distance that politeness maintains. She had learned that he was patient with animals beyond what patience generally demanded, that he could work in silence for long stretches with a focused quality that was not unfriendly but was simply complete in itself, and that he made decisions quickly in a crisis and said afterward, if anything, only what was relevant. She had learned that he noticed when she was cold before she said so, and adjusted without comment. She had learned that he had a dry, sparse humor that emerged occasionally in the dark hours of a difficult night when the guard was down and showed itself in a single, understated remark that she almost missed the first time and laughed at properly on the second. He had laughed once, not the almost smile, not the controlled adjustment at the corners of the mouth. Actually laughed briefly at something she said about a particularly uncooperative heifer, and it had lasted perhaps 3 seconds before he caught himself, but she had heard it, and she thought she would probably remember it for a long time. By the time February ended and March arrived with its tentative and unreliable warmth, they had been married 3 weeks, and the house had begun, incrementally and without announcement, to become the kind of place it had been designed to be. There were still bare spaces on the walls. There would likely always be bare spaces on the walls. But the spaces were a choice now rather than an erasure, and that was different. On the first warm morning, Winifred went to the front porch with a spade and a paper packet of seeds. Climbing roses, a hardy variety suited to altitude, guaranteed to return each year. She was turning the soil at the base of the porch post when Cormac came out and stood behind her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, not because he had a task that required him to be there, but because she was there, which had become, gradually and without announcement, reason enough. "They'll come back every year," she said, pressing the first seeds into the cold, dark earth. "No matter how hard the winter." He was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," he said. She looked up at him over her shoulder. He was looking at the mountains, the great indifferent peaks that had made his father into a closed room and tried their best to do the same to him. And his face in the morning light was not the face she had seen in October, not guarded and measured and perpetually braced. It was something quieter and less armored and entirely, recognizably his. He looked down at her then. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a large thing. A small, private, genuine thing that she had seen perhaps 4 times in all the months since October, each time more certainly than the last. She turned back to her planting. He sat down on the porch step beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and watched her work in the early spring light. He did not offer to help. He did not say anything. He was simply present in the full and unhurried way he had slowly, over the course of one mountain winter, learned to be. She pressed the last of the seeds into the earth and patted the soil flat with her palm and sat back on her heels. The mountain air was cold still, sharp with the particular quality of early spring at altitude where winter has not entirely conceded. The peaks above were white. Below them, the valley was beginning to show the first pale green of the season's first grass. Gerald Finch would come up the trail on Thursday with the week's mail and would stay for coffee and would talk more than both of them combined, which was easy, and would leave with the expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect and is quietly pleased about it. Ruth Hatfield would come the following week with a jar of preserved plums and would stay for 2 hours and would say, when she left, that the house looked different, by which she meant the thing she had noticed from the first time she had come and found the trunk being packed, the quality of a house in which decisions have been made. The roses would bloom in June. They would die back in October and return in April, and die back again and return again, year after year, indifferent to the winters between. She looked at the soil where she had planted them, the dark earth turned and ready, and thought about what grows back, about the things that appear to be finished and are not, about the difference between an ending and a conclusion, between loss and the transformation that follows it when the season changes and the ground thaws and what was buried turns out to have been waiting all along. Cormac shifted on the step beside her, not to leave, just the movement of a man settling into a place he intends to stay. Inside the house, the curtains moved gently in the morning air from the window she had left open, the window whose crack she had sealed with her thumb on her third day, in a room that had a lock she had never needed to use. The mountain stood above them as it always had, enormous and indifferent and entirely unchanged. But the light in the window was warm, and this time it stayed on.